Friends, good afternoon. Welcome to another week in the season of the coronavirus. I'm Pastor Patrick. I'm glad to be sharing a moment of devotion with you today. And I've been thinking about how this has been a season not just of one trial or a single affliction or difficulty in our lives, but really it's been a series, a cluster, a constellation of events that have intersected in a time and a season that seems ripe for change in our lives, and both as individuals and as a community. The question before us is whether or not we will learn those lessons and take those changes to heart and ask, what is God doing in our midst? And two, how are we going to respond to it? You know, it's hard to sometimes internalize the lessons that are around us in times like this, when we struggle and we see pain and hardship in the world. It is a privilege in many ways to be able to gloss over such things and leave them behind us. And yet I feel that for us as Christians, as a people whose faith implores us to seek understanding from others, is that we pause to learn the lessons that we need to learn during this season where this, as I said, constellation of events and difficulties and hardships seem to have coalesced into a single season of our lives. I think about how in the time of the prophet Elijah, he was really the only prophet left true to God, and how the King Ahaz and Jezebel drove him out seeking his life, and he was afraid. He goes up to the mountaintop, right? And he's on the mountaintop and he's looking for God. And he looks, there's a thunderstorm, there's a violent wind, there's an earthquake. Doesn't hear God in any of that, but rather hears God's very quiet voice as a whisper, the text says. God's voice came to him not in the great and powerful, but in the whispers. And so I wonder what in these times, in the midst of all the calamity that seems to be amuck around us, and the lives that are being torn apart by various things, various injustices like racism, the strife that's caused in our communities, the injustices that have been exposed by the coronavirus, the sickness and the death that has come from that. In the midst of that, how are we listening for God's voice, perhaps in the whispers, in the spaces between the events, between the loud voices that are speaking? And what is God saying to us? I found in my own journey wisdom in many places. And one of the places that I love to turn is to the desert fathers and mothers, the ascetic Christians of the 4th and 5th century who saw opportunity for growth and grace and love by seeking solitude in the deserts of Egypt and Libya and those areas in North Africa. And so what happened was many men and women moved out into convents, into the deserts, to seek solitude so that they might align themselves more completely with God. Now that's not a calling that every Christian is called to. Certainly there are still monastic communities and traditions that have flowed from these original people, like St. Anthony the Great, who was one of the first and the major figures in this group. But we actually have extant writings from those times, and they're in a collection that we share together. And there's wonderful things from men and women who were in these monastic communities back in the day. And all of them have this remarkable and surprising wisdom that is simple in its design, but also has remarkable wit and sometimes a comedic edge, but also a very deep spiritual foundation for it. And here's one example that came to mind as I'm thinking about how we're listening for God in the midst of this, and what lessons we might learn and how we might live accordingly. So one of the fathers, and they all go by the name Abba or Amma if it's a woman, and in their name. So this is Abba Poemen. And Abba Poemen said, "Teach your heart to follow what your tongue is saying to others." He also said, "People try to appear excellent in preaching, but they are less excellent in practicing what they preach." It's from the 5th century, a long time ago, right? 1,500 some years ago. And even then, there was a sense that sometimes what we're speaking and the way that we're doing things is not embodying what it is that we say we believe. And I think one of the greatest virtues of discipleship is that it teaches us to live a life of congruence, where what we believe about the God who raised Jesus Christ from the dead, having first raised Israel from Egypt, are things that we need to be acting on and living on accordingly. If we say we believe in Jesus Christ, and yet how we act in times of hardship and when we see the suffering of others and injustices taking place don't match those things, then perhaps it's time that we take a second look and challenge ourselves to really listen for God in the spaces, to listen for God's still small voice, as the older translations of the Bible that most of us are familiar with says. God was not to be found for the prophet Elijah in the loud earthquakes and the booming calamity of his time. It was to be found in the stillness of the wind, in the stillness of solitude, in the solitude of prayer. Abba Poemen, I think, is wise to say that we must be careful that how we live matches what our tongues loose, that our actions are embodiments of our beliefs and our words. And if the things that we're saying to one another in these times are disbelieving and are causing harm to other people, then those are not the right lessons that we need to be learning. The lessons that we need to be learning is how can we, as disciples of Jesus, embody the humility that his life within us calls us to? How can we train ourselves by listening for God's still small voice, to also listen to the voices of others whose pain is very real and who cry out to us who are in the church? What is our mission to be? I think our mission is to be loving by listening, by striking always first to be humble in all things, and moving to act in accordance with what it is that we say we believe. Every Sunday lately, especially since the time of coronavirus, we've been revisiting several of the creeds, the ancient creeds of the church, which are basically succinct statements of what we believe about who God is and how God is for us in space and time. And those creeds are foundational because they lay out what we believe the orthodox, the right and true faith, as expressed in the Old and New Testaments, is. Does my life align with what those statements or what the scriptures say about who God is? Am I seeing in my own self a life of congruence, a life in which is increasingly taking the shape of Jesus's life, a life of humility, of moving towards others, of listening, of helping, of taking time to value others because they are bearers of the image and likeness of the triune God? Just something to think about on this day. Taking wisdom from Elijah's intimacy with God, hearing God not in the calamity but in the stillness of his solitude. Using that to train ourselves to listen and to love well those whom God places in our lives. And moving, as the Desert Fathers and Mothers said, to align what it is that we do with what it is we say we believe, so that the genuineness of our faith points others to the glory of God. Have a wonderful Monday, folks. I hope you're enjoying this reprieve from the heat, and that if you are a grower of green things, that they are loving the rain and that you get to see their beauty. For it is always that if we pay attention to the simple things and give thanks for them, we can give thanks for the much larger things as well. Friends, go in peace. We love you.